Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today is Poetry Thursday, a great day to talk about some of the most exciting poetry or interesting poetry or whatever that I have stumbled across or have sought out either through recommendations or just because I was hungry for that kind of poetry. Today I want to talk about a poem from a poet that was recommended to me by a friend. Shout out to Cassie out there. It's a poem that adapts a fairy tale into the poem form. I am referring to Cinderella by Sylvia Plath. For those who don't know, and I feel like a lot of people would know who Sylvia Plath is, but for those who don't, she was an American poet who lived in the 1900s. She was part of the confessionalist movement, which is one of my favorite movements of poetry that was intense and personal, often focusing inwards or focusing on social justice issues, which you saw very much in Sylvia Plath's work, often focusing on herself as a woman or as a mother, or sometimes throwing shade at her husband, which she didn't like very much, or just talking about feminism in general. You saw a lot of that in her work. And she was an acclaimed poet, although a lot of her work didn't get published until after her death. She killed herself, and a lot of that is due to the depression, anxieties that she was facing, mixed with the unhappy relationship that she was in with her husband. I believe his name is Ted something or other. He was a really famous poet too, although a lot of people have viewed him recently as abusive or a bit manipulative in what he did after Sylvia Plath's death, which is publish a lot of her works, even though like some of it maybe wasn't meant to be published. Feels a little bit personal at times, which we again see with like Emily Dickinson or Emily Bronte, with just a whole bunch of poets who die and then people publish their writings after they die, and it's like, do we really need to publish the work of dead people? Isn't that an invasion of privacy? But I feel like I talk about that way too much on this channel. But anyways, Sylvia Plath was a really good poet, one of my favorites, ranking up there with like Charles Bukowski and Poe and a lot of the other confessionalists as well. Emily Dickinson too. So without further ado though, let's talk about this poem. I will read it, do a brief analysis, and we will move on from there. Cinderella. The prince leans to the girl in scarlet heels, her green eyes slant, hair flaring in a fan of silver as the rondo slows. Now reels begin on tilted violins to span the whole revolving tall glass palace hall, where guests slide gliding into light like wine. Rose candles flicker on the lilac wall, reflecting in a million flagons and shine. And glided couples, all in whirling trance, follow holiday revel begun long since, until near 12 the strange girl all at once guilt-stricken halts, pales, clings to the prince. As amid the hectic music and cocktail talk, she hears the caustic ticking of the clock. So that was Cinderella by Sylvia Plath. In terms of analysis, there is a bit to talk about with this poem. The first thing that I want to note is the beautiful imagery that she uses. There's only a couple verses in this poem, but she does a really good job of setting up the scenery of this beautiful palace, where she says, the whole revolving tall glass palace hall, where guests slide gliding into light like wine. Rose candles flicker on the lilac wall, reflecting in a million flagons and shine. And so you see that image in her head that she helps create of this sort of tall palace hall, endless in a lot of ways, roses and flagons, like beer mugs, beer steins everywhere, candles everywhere. Like it's a very beautiful scene, and you can picture in your head, if you're not familiar with Cinderella, you can even picture it of what is going on in the scene of a beautiful dance happening. But she kind of makes it seem very hectic at the end of the poem when she says, "Until near 12, the strange girl all at once, guilt-stricken, halts, pales, clings to the prince, as amid the hectic music and cocktail talk, she hears the caustic ticking of the clock." And so there you can see, amid all of this beautiful scenery, there's this one girl there panicking because she hears the clock. And why might she be like panicking in that way? Like, why is she guilt-stricken? And I think a lot of that has to do with the fairy tale of Cinderella, where we know that like the woman in this story like has to get home by the time the clock strikes midnight, or else she's going to revert back to her non-glamorous state. So very interesting scenery and the way she describes everything here. I also think it's worth talking about the phrasing and the words that she chooses to use, because this poem really flows. And this isn't just something that I've encountered with this poem. A lot of Sylvia Plath's poems have good word choice and good structure, in that they flow, and it seems like very dreamy in that way. I said it earlier, but I'll say it again. The whole revolving tall glass palace hall, where guests slide gliding into light like wine. And you could say like tall glass palace hall. Like those words sound similar enough that they rhyme, and they really help make the poem easier to say, especially out loud. Guests slide gliding into light like wine. That you get a good image of what they're doing, but also the wordplay is really clever, I would say, on Sylvia Plath's part, and it really shows like intentionality here, like what she's saying and how she's writing it. She's choosing to write it in a specific way, which can't be easy. Like writing poetry is already difficult, but writing it in a specific way that you can say what you want to say, but also make it flow like that. That sounds really hard, and it shows her skill. The other thing worth noting is, why is Cinderella like guilt-stricken? I find that word choice interesting to use because it might be reflective of like feminist ideology or something like that, where she says, "Until near 12, the strange girl all at once, guilt-stricken, halts, pales, clings to the prince, as amid the hectic music and cocktail talk." And I feel like that's weird. Like I just talked about how she was intentional with her word choice. So why would she use the word cocktail? Cocktail feels like a very modern word for what's happening in the story of Cinderella, because Cinderella is medieval times with castles and princes and whatnot. But did they have cocktails during that time? I don't think so. She's bringing it to a more modern era. And along with that, like Cinderella is guilt-stricken, so maybe she's not turning into the commoner or anything like that. Maybe she's just drastically realizing that this is a terrible relationship she doesn't want to be in. Maybe it's the like an internal like fear of being found out as a failure or something like that. I'm probably leaping here. But based on what I know about Sylvia Plath's life, based on her feminist leanings and whatnot, like this doesn't feel like a leap to point out that the ending of this poem is very unusual. To describe everything as beautiful, and then when you finally get to this woman, like who's the main center of the focus of the poem, it's called Cinderella, but we only focus on her in the last 4 lines, and that feels significant. And so for that to happen, it feels like she's trying to say something about Cinderella. Like she either doesn't want to be here, or she's afraid of this life being taken away from her, which that might have been the case for Sylvia Plath. Although she wasn't happy in her relationship with Ted, in her poetry, she does describe being happy with her children. And so maybe she didn't want that taken away from her. It's it's a bit unclear. I feel like you could go even deeper than I have in this poem, I would encourage you to do so, as I'm going to link to it in the description. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Cinderella by Sylvia Plath, a really quality poem that I feel like I didn't really do justice to. I always feel like that when I talk about Sylvia Plath poems. Although this is the first one I've done for this channel, I've talked about Sylvia Plath in poetry classes and other areas before, and it's just hard to really grab on everything that Sylvia Plath is saying because her work is pretty dense even when it's pretty short. She's saying a lot, and it's especially helpful to know her past and what happened in her life, as that could guide us in our poetry. Especially because she didn't really get a chance to tell us about it, given that she killed herself in the 1960s. And the only person we can really rely on is her husband, who might have been abusive towards her, allegedly, or something like that. So, if you have anything to say about Sylvia Plath or this poem today, comment below and let's have a discussion about this interesting poem. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this poem, this author, and Poetry Thursday, as those things are worth talking about on BookTube. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and fairy tale-ish travels. Farewell.